Like a lot of 80s and 90s edgelord alternative kids, I was heavily into Marilyn Manson in the 90s and 2000s. I was a fan of the band from the beginning and kind of fell off when Eat Me, Drink Me came out, but everything up to and including Golden Age of Grotesque was my era. As anyone who was a Manson fan of the late 90s and early 2000s know, they were one of the bands that had an official forum on their website. For noobs, a forum, or BBS as we call it, was basically like a band-related subreddit with different sections, where you could post threads similar to Reddit. Official forums for bands barely exist anymore because there's all sorts of legal culpability for what gets posted on them these days. Back then, it was basically a free-for-all. Some very insane stuff went down on the Marilyn Manson forums, with people posting extreme shock images and remaining unbanned, or shocking photos of themselves or hurling abuse at each other, making the most offensive edgelord jokes you can imagine, and it was glorious. And I was a girly girl who loved pink and rainbows and prom and stuff, and also loved darky, edgy humor and Marilyn Manson and far harder and darker music. I thought that this made me so unique, and so my online persona was based around being a glittery pink princess in a world of goths and monsters. And what do you know? The goths and monsters loved it, and me, and appreciated the subversive nature of the joke. Cool, I did a funny. And I was a bit of a novelty when I registered on the forum, and immediately got taken under the wing of the cool kids, people like Perfect, Skinny Puppy, Stigma, and a sardonic lesbian called Katie, a skinny guy from Scranton who wore a tutu called Gordy, the DXM Queen, those types of people. And I was bullied by men with names like Celibate Adam, Mugwump, Cranboy, and Derek, but it was all in good fun, and I bit back. We all hated each other with loving affection, and to this day it was one of my favorite communities I've ever been a part of. I think it helped because 3 of the cool kids, Perfect, Skinny, and Katie, were actually kids I knew from school. I'd overheard them talking about the Marilyn Manson BBS and told them that I was a fan. They didn't believe me because I was a cheerleader and theater kid, so I signed up and demonstrated my knowledge and showed that I was down for the lulz, and that's how we became friends. We didn't really hang out IRL, but it was nice to know that some of my online friends were also my school pals if I ever did need to chill with them. One member of the Manson forum was called Jordy Dark. He'd regularly post pictures of himself. He had this thick milk bottle glasses, a porn star mustache, huge sideburns, a mullet, and the lankiest, skinniest, palest body you've ever seen. A very odd-looking fella, but kind of interesting. And we never really hung out, but he'd sometimes comment on my posts with things like, heh, or nice, or lol. And one day, Jordy sent me a private message asking when we were going to start chatting. I was down to chat with anyone, so I said, well, now is fine, and we began talking about music, of course. And surprise, surprise, we shared a lot of the same tastes, which is pretty expected when you meet on the message board of a band. There were about 4 things we talked about: the Blair Witch Project, Marilyn Manson, Hole, the band, and the X-Files. We were both big fans of all of these things that, for alternative kids, was very mainstream. Jordy took this as a sign that we were absolute soulmates, though, and every single day after that, he'd commented on all my posts as if though we were best friends. He'd also send me lengthy private messages talking about, I don't really know what, really. The weirdest part was that he'd decided that I was depressed, sad, anxious goth girl who was a danger to herself and needed to be lifted out of her pit of misery. At no point had I ever suggested this. Just because a lot of other girls on the forum were like that didn't mean I was, but it seemed like Jordy had just decided that I was as a means of saving me and didn't even care that it wasn't real. It was intensely infuriating having a guy talk to you about your mental health disorders and depression that don't even exist, treating you like a patient who he can save with his love and care. I could ignore it in PMs, but he started commenting like this on my posts too. It became really irritating, especially when others would try and interact with me and joke around, sometimes aggressively, sure, because that was how we interacted in fun. But he would rush to my defense. He'd warn people to leave me alone, threaten them if they insulted me, and it started making me look bad too, I didn't want some creep defending me like this, especially from people I consider friends. I tried to tell Jordy a bunch of times that I didn't want this, and he flat out told me that I simply didn't know what was best for me due to my mental illness. And he said that I was numb because of the medication. I'm like, bro, I don't even take aspirin. And I started to ignore Jordy after this. Unfortunately, the BBS software didn't have a function where you could block individual people. The only way they could stop messaging you was if they got banned. It wasn't really something we did, reporting each other to the admin, and it was generally considered a big no-no, so I didn't file any complaints about Jordy. We encouraged mob justice, which meant that me and my friends would clown on Jordy. We'd call him a loser, creep, and weirdo whenever he posted strange crap about me. Jordy didn't care, though. He'd just reply with a heh, and continue posting his strange, poorly lit photos of himself where he looked like a 70s serial killer. In one of the last private messages Jordy sent me, he told me he forgave me for how my friends treated him. He said that he wouldn't let it get in the way of our life together and that one day he'd come and rescue me from these creeps. Like I said, I was in high school at this point, in my junior year. Perfect, Skinny, and Katie also went to my school and they were in their senior year, which is another reason that we didn't hang out in school really. One day I was in class and got a message from the office that my dad had arrived to take me out of school due to a family emergency. Weird, since my dad walked out when I was 3. I have a stepdad though, but it was unusual that he'd introduce himself as my dad. We got along great, but he was Leon, not Dad, and that was fine. Maybe the office just screwed up though. I got a pass, left class, and headed to the office. Even down the hall, I couldn't see Leon or anyone. The secretary said that my dad was out in the parking lot and that she was sorry to hear about my aunt. I did have a crazy wine aunt living in another state, my mom's sister, so my heart flip-flopped as I rushed into the parking lot. Once there, I froze in my tracks. There was a filthy-looking camper van parked up across the 3 spots. It was covered in faded flower power graffiti and some lewd imagery of women. Leaning against the camper van was a guy I both recognized and didn't. It was Jordy from the Marilyn Manson forums, but it wasn't exactly him. Remember I said that in his photos he looked like a serial killer from the 70s? That's because those photos likely were taken in the 70s. The guy who stood lounging against the camper smoking a cigarette looked like Jordy but aged 30 years or more. His long hippie hair was gray, and so was his mustache, and his face was a map of wrinkles and lines that suggested hard living and hard drugs. He wore filthy bell-bottom jeans and a cowskin vest, open over his bare pigeon chest, and I kid you not, he looked like a hippie who hadn't changed his clothes or washed since 1969. I stopped short, but elderly Jordy caught sight of me across the parking lot. His deranged face split into a frantic grin, and he began striding toward me. He called out my forum username, and that's when I knew that it was definitely him. He began ranting about how he'd finally come to save me and take me away from the filth. And I began to back away and told him to F off. But he came over to me and grabbed my wrist, hard. I yelled at him to get off of me, and by now some other students and faculty were beginning to pay attention. I saw a friend I recognized and yelled that this dude was some random guy off the internet and he was trying to kidnap me and to please go get the principal, the cops, or whatever. They ran off and Jordy began dragging me towards his stinking, dirty camper van. God knows what depraved fate lay in store for me behind those doors, and I screamed and tried to pull away. But for an old guy, he was incredibly strong, and his sandaled feet slapped over the parking lot as he heaved me towards his serial killer murder van, or so it seemed to me at the time. Out of nowhere, a voice yelled at him to let me the F go and back off. I turned, and my 3 forum buddies from school, Perfect, Skinny, and Katie, came barreling over. Skinny raised her skateboard and cracked Jordy across the back with it, causing the old board to actually break. Jordy let go of me and howled in fury. Katie swung her bag, covered in band badges and patches, and battered Jordy in the head, sending him back further. And then Perfect, the guy who was this tiny, short goth kid, displayed surprising strength by pinning hippie Jordy's arms behind his back and rushing him forward across the parking lot, slamming him against the minivan. Jordy then crumples to the ground, and Perfect pinned him down, yelling for security or really anyone. Katie and Skinny guided me away and checked that I was okay. I told them I was, and then mentioned how wild it was that Jordy had literally tracked me down from the forums and arrived here. They were floored. They had no idea who they'd been fighting. They'd just seen some old guy dragging me across the parking lot and ran to my aid. They hadn't even paid attention to who it was, but as soon as I told them, they realized I was right. It was him. The cops came and he was taken away, and the four of us got to go home for the rest of the day. The first thing we did was talk online, and finally we did report this to the forum admins, who banned Jordy immediately. The others really wanted to post this epic tale to the forums, but we realized that it probably wasn't a good idea since it was an ongoing investigation and it probably would show where we're from. And to this day, I have no idea how Jordy actually found the town that I live in and the school that I go to. He insisted I told him, and also claimed that I'd asked him to come collect me from the school that day. It was my word against his, ultimately, and as much as I hated having to let things drop, there was a talk of him trying to push assault charges on my friends if I didn't. Ultimately, I had to let this potential predator go free, and my mom and stepdad were absolutely furious about all of it. It kinda sucks knowing that Jordy didn't face any real repercussions for his actions, and I have to really hope that it was enough to snap him out of whatever kind of weird stupor he was in, and make sure he left teenage girls alone. So I've been a listener for a few years now. I have a story I've always wanted to share with you, but I've never been able to bring myself to actually write it down and send it in because it kind of makes me sick to my damn stomach. So my lovely wife, who introduced me to your channel, has finally convinced me to send it in, so I hope your listeners get a few chuckles, or more likely shivers, at the completely effed up thing that happened to me, my sister, and my mom when I was a kid. Do you remember AOL Instant Messenger? It started off as an instant messenger client for people who had AOL as a service provider, but eventually anyone could use it. It was the messenger program of choice for the 90s and 2000 kids, with the creative away messages you could write and being one of the first that let you choose your own user picture and username display. You could also customize it so it would give you alert pop-ups for specific people in your friends list too, and you could assign any sound file you wanted as the alert noise. And because of what happened, I genuinely can't hear the audio clip of Cartman saying, "Screw you guys," without cringing and feeling a little spike of panic. Her name was Gloria, which sounded made up even then. I don't know why, but I could never believe that someone my age would actually be named Gloria. And she insisted it was her real name though, and that she was named after the Laura Branigan song. And that's funny, I said. That's my mom and stepdad's song. Small world, she said, and suggested it was fate that we became friends. Gloria messaged me a lot, always after 9 p.m. She told me she had various clubs and a lot of commitments. Her birth mom lived across the country and barely saw her, and her biological dad had died a couple of years ago, so she was stuck living with her strict Christian fundamentalist stepmom. I told her that I had a stepdad, but we got along pretty well, but it was firm and fair, and my mom, on the other hand, treated me like the baby, because I was. And we'd been online friends for a few months by that time. I started telling her things about my family, and I trusted her a lot. She'd first added me on AIM, which let you find and add random people as part of a feature it had that would never exist these days. A few of the instant messenger programs used to revolve around meeting new friends online, like IQC, IRC, Yahoo Messenger, etc. Gloria had added me as a friend one day and I'd accepted, because you just did that back then. It was before the days of Facebook and things, and when everyone's real name was attached to their profiles. It was totally normal to chat to a rando, and if they were a freak, then you just blocked them and moved on. It was the Wild West, and we weren't as careful as we should have been. but in some cases that led to surprise long-term friendships. And that's what I thought was happening with Gloria, a genuine friend for life. And this all went down before cell phone cameras were a thing, and most kids didn't even have digital cameras, but I'd seen a couple of photos of her scanned from her yearbook photo, and I'd sent her scans of my class photos as well. And I came to really value Gloria's company. She was there for me when I was having a hard time at school with one of my teachers, and she was there when me and my friends were being targeted by a couple of guys in the grade above. She listened to me lament about my lack of love life, even though I was kind of vague about this at first as a shy 15-year-old. And one day I told Gloria about my sister, who was a few years older than me and graduating from high school that year. Lacey is a good kid. And I say kid even though she's my senior, but I feel protective of her like that. And she was back then too, but in her senior year she was stressing about graduation a lot and the upcoming anxiety of college, and she started turning to very mild substances in order to cope. She was just taking something similar to Adderall and occasionally dabbled in prescription painkillers, but none of them were things that she was meant to be taking, and so I stressed and worried about her. As a 15-year-old, I felt it a bit lame to tell my 18-year-old sister that I loved and cared about her, so I told Gloria instead. After that, Gloria kept asking about Lacey a lot. I didn't like this. It made me a bit jealous as well as protective, and I guess Gloria picked up on that because she started to be extra nice to me. Love bombing, I think the kids call it these days. She'd ask me to hang out with her almost every night, playing Habbo Hotel and Club Penguin and various flash games. I started to develop a real strong bond with her, and I genuinely came to deeply value her company. I guess Gloria valued mine too, because one Friday in the November of my sophomore year of high school, Gloria told me that she'd fallen in love with me. I didn't really know what to say. I loved Gloria as a friend, and I didn't feel that way about her. We'd never met, for one thing. And instead of breaking her heart, I suggested that maybe we could talk on the phone. Gloria freaked out at this and actually blocked me for a hot minute, and I felt awful. I'd somehow offended her and had no idea why. Had she been able to tell that I didn't feel the same? A few days of feeling lousy went past, and then "Screw You Guys" played from my computer, that Cartman sound, and Gloria was online. And I felt a little nervous and a little panicky. We talked long into the night. Gloria spun a strange tale that didn't make a lot of sense, and I'm not going to bother repeating it because, spoiler, it was completely made up. Short version though, the idea of speaking on the phone terrified her, but she was down to actually meet in real life. She said she thought things could be a lot easier if we'd meet up and talk. This sounded like a terrible, dangerous idea to me, so naturally, as a 15-year-old boy, I agreed to it immediately. We decided to meet in a park near my house, and I asked her how she knew where I lived and how she could be there when she lived across the state, and she told me that there was something that she needed to confess to me, but I shouldn't be scared. She was still the same Gloria I knew and trusted. Obviously, I was very suspicious, but I'd known this girl for months. We'd shared everything. We were close friends. Even if she had a dark secret, I could look past it. Maybe she was a friend from school who was too shy to admit who she was. Maybe she was a dude. Honestly, I would have been fine with Gloria being a boy my age. Maybe he had gender confusion issues or something, but what I didn't really consider was the possibility that it was worse, and then worse again. I showed up to the park a bit early. The sun was just beginning to set, and I started to realize that even though we'd picked a public place to meet, the time and area of the park meant that nobody else was really around. It was a small parking lot and abandoned store on the edge of the park with a couple of benches I could wait on. And I sat there, and eventually a car pulled into the parking lot, windows down, blasting "Thy Unveiling" by Insane Clown Posse from the open windows. I remember this vividly because I'd been hella into that band and that CD in particular when I was in middle school. This was a few years later, and I'd stopped listening to the album, but someone who knew me and was trying to impress me, but hadn't really paid close attention for the last few years, could feasibly play it to win me over. It wasn't just the song that caused my mind to go there. I also recognized the car. It was the car I'd ridden to school many times a few years ago. listening to that very CD and refusing to enter into conversation with the man in the driver's seat, my stepdad, Mom's then new husband, Carl. Carl pulled the car to a stop, climbed out and walked over to me, Insane Clown Posse still blaring from the stereo. I cringed. It was obvious what had happened. Carl had found out that I was meeting Gloria, a stranger from the internet, and had decided to intercept me. How did he know? Did Mom and Carl have some kind of parental lock or monitoring on the computer? Carl sat down next to me, and the truth was way more horrifying. Carl was Gloria. It had started out as a way to keep an eye on me and what I was getting up to online, and then he started enjoying being Gloria. He began digging his double life. I didn't want to believe it at first, but he was able to perfectly recount every interaction I'd had with Gloria. It was way more direct than if he'd read our chat logs or monitored our conversations. Only the other conversation participant could be this aware. At first, I was mad that my stepdad was keeping an eye on me. Then I remembered the event that had led to all of this. He, Gloria, said he was in love with me. I asked Carl what in God's name had caused him to say that. And Carl looked sheepish and almost shy, and then his face started to turn red. And in that moment, Carl changed. He'd always been kind of a pushover. I never really respected him because I thought he was less of a man than my dad had been, and he let my mom push him around too. He certainly wasn't an abusive, cruel, or strict stepdad, but how he physically grabbed me by the collar, dragged me towards him, and hissed in my ear. He said if I told anyone what he'd said or done as Gloria, then he would ruin my sister's life. I felt a cold, sick feeling in my stomach. I'd told Gloria all about Lacey's struggles. I didn't think it mattered because I thought Gloria was a kid my age on the internet who lived on the other side of the country. But no, she was my damn stepdad, and now my stepdad had about 1 million pieces of damning info about his stepdaughter Lacey. We rode home. ICP was still playing and it drove me nuts. And eventually I asked Carl what I could do to keep the peace and make sure that he left Stacy alone. And I was feeling sick and terrified. I'd lost my best friend Gloria, and worse, found out that she'd never even been real. But I'd also screwed my sister over in the process and found out that the stepdad, who I'd always considered a non-entity, was a complete creepo. Carl said he wanted to keep up the facade, that I had to continue talking to him as Gloria, pretending he was a 15-year-old girl whenever we spoke online. And something about this chilled me to my absolute core. He'd already confessed his love to me. What did he mean by keeping up the facade? How far was he expecting me to go with Gloria? And at first I really tried, for Lacey's sake. Carl kept up his persona of Gloria almost perfectly, just letting it slip enough to 100% prove to me it was in fact him. Comments like, "See you at dinner," that could have looked innocuous to anyone reading the chat logs, or a vague reference to something he'd said in person. There was no doubt that he was Gloria, but for the most part he kept up the pretense of being my 15-year-old female internet friend, a very affectionate friend. I don't really want to talk about that part, and thankfully it could have been a lot worse. But Carl Gloria definitely did start trying to push things further with me, and that's when I broke. I couldn't take it anymore. I confessed it all to Lacey one night when we were alone in the house. I expected her to be furious at me and to kick my ass, but she was totally chill and understanding. She explained gently to me that her drug problem was extremely minor recreational use and she hadn't taken anything in months, so even if Carl did try to expose her, there was really nothing to expose. She said it was very sweet that I was so worried about her, but kind of laughed at me for being overly cautious and neurotic and really sensible. And that was great news though, because it meant that I didn't have to tolerate Carl anymore. And that night, Lacey and I assessed his computer. His password was our mom's date of birth, and found chat logs between Gloria and a whole bunch of other kids online. And from what we could tell, Carl had been talking to at least 5 or 6 other teenage boys as Gloria. He'd never taken things irreparably far yet, but there was at least one conversation where he was beginning to try and encourage this one richer kid to use his allowance to buy a digital camera and send him revealing photos. We printed everything out that night before Carl could cover his tracks and then showed it to our mother. She obviously was horrified, and the next day, Carl was gone. Mom handled everything. I know law enforcement were involved, and I don't know if at the time laws allowed for Carl to be monitored for catfishing, as back in the early 2000s online laws were obviously pretty patchy. And Carl died in the mid-2010s, alone and single, thankfully. I kept an eye on him all these years because I promised myself that I'd never allow him to actually hurt a kid. I can't be sure that I succeeded, but it seems like he kept his head down until his death, so I feel like I did my job as best I could till he passed away of cancer. These days, it's very easy to verify who you're talking to, but as for us 2000s kids, things were different. I know plenty of friends my age who have had similar unpleasant experiences with adult strangers online, and my advice is not to suffer in silence. Talk about it. It really helps. Trust me. So something very strange happened to me a few years ago. Because I can't tell it without giving away some identifiable information, I can't say exactly where it happened, but it was a major US city. I don't think I'm in any danger from telling this story, I just have a very good reason to be cautious. I've been furloughed during the 2020 pandemic, and my stimulus check was starting to run out. I'd split up with my boyfriend because living together in lockdown had revealed that he was a massive Jordan Peterson guy, and before I blocked him on Facebook, I think he was getting into QAnon. So I was starting to get worried about money. I'd got into a routine of waking up and making some black coffee and then checking all the job listing sites for remote work. When nothing turned up, I'd usually hit one of the few gyms that were still open. Working out made me feel like that I still had some control over my body. And that day was different though, because before I could open my crossword app, I saw a Facebook message about an exciting new job opportunity with flexible hours and daily earnings up to $1,000. It was a multi-level marketing scheme to sell overpriced makeup. I blocked and reported them for scams and thought that would be the end of it. There was a new girl at the gym that day, but she seemed to be more interested in her phone than working out, probably trying to choose the right selfies to post. I tried to ignore her and worked on my arms. After showering and changing into a strappy top and leggings, I went to the nearby Starbucks for a frappe. There were some more scam messages, which I didn't even bother reading this time before blocking them, and there must have been about 5 different accounts, all with the same kinds of messages and the same profile photo of a woman in her 30s with lip fillers and pretty good eye makeup. It was about this point when I realized that she was in the coffee shop, only about 3 tables away. I froze. I went to that gym almost every day. I was in the Starbucks nearly as often, and she had to have seen me here, probably got my name from them calling out for my drink orders and guessed the rest on Facebook. And this was no coincidence. Another terrible thought struck me. I googled the makeup brand, 0 results. And that kind of company is almost built on search engine optimization. There was no way that it would have had a digital footprint. And like most people, I didn't know much about multi-level marketing companies. The scale at which most of the recruiters message people is a little frightening, and you're told to find up to hundreds of people each day and tell them their unique qualities make them suited to the MLM. So when I found out that the MLM company wasn't even real, it made a lot more sense how she'd had the time to do so much research on me. I later found out from friends and ex-coworkers that she'd been messaging them, asking questions about me and just giving a very weird vibe. I was so shocked that I almost ran out of the coffee shop. And of course, she followed me after taking a sip from my unfinished drink. I asked her what the hell she was doing, and in the end, it turned out to be about a man that I'd just forgotten about. She claimed I'd stolen her ex, and in reality, he'd never told me that he was in a relationship, and when he proved to be useless in every way that mattered, I ended it. The next week, I'd seen him with another woman and I barely even cared. I didn't steal her boyfriend, and she would have been better off without him. I tried to tell her as much, but she was clearly obsessed with me now, and it didn't really matter how she'd started. It felt very strange trying to run away from her without wanting to make it obvious that something weird was happening, and as if by not showing it, I could avoid the situation that I was in. She didn't seem to care about that, so I was forced to run away from her. Not sure where else to go, I ran for the subway with her not far behind. And I thought back to my wilder teenage years as I cleanly jumped over the turnstile, leaving her scrambling to pay the fare. And I ran down the platform and jumped through the subway car doors and tried to make my way along the packed train. Just as the doors were closing, she made it into the car, and I waved at her as the train started to move and walked back up the steps to get a cab home. I don't have my name on any social media accounts now, and I deleted most of them. Even if you could work out who I am from this, you'll never find me online. I don't really take selfies anymore, not on any public accounts, and of course I got multiple restraining orders on her, but I still don't want to take any chances. Unless she's gotten the help she needs, then she's probably stalking someone else right now. I have a very close friend who tells me I need to move because I resent having to keep a file on my own stalker. And I'm only writing this because I think if she escalates again, that she might get caught. I'm from Old Blighty, and I've got a proper corker of a yarn to share with you today, old chap. Just kidding, we don't actually talk like that, but that was the first message I received from the girl that I'll call Handcuffs. She said that she'd seen my MySpace and liked my photography and thought it was funny that I came from Old Blighty. She was fascinated by British slang and British culture and kept making weird British jokes to me, calling me old chap and that kind of stuff. And I found it pretty enduring that a hot alternative Californian chick was impressed by my Britishness. And I figured the rumor was true, that American chicks dig British guys despite our awful teeth and love of bland cuisine. And I was even more impressed when Handcuffs told me the site that she'd worked for. You can't actually say the name on YouTube, but let's just say that it's a modeling site that still exists to this day, which could be known as Unalive Lasses, if you catch my drift. And you probably get it by now. Handcuffs told me that she was an unalive lass, and sent some photos that did indeed suggest that she was such. And I could see her on the public version of the website, but a number of the photos were definitely from the paying members only area, if you catch my drift. And of course, it didn't really occur to my dumb hormone-fueled self that someone could have just subscribed to the site to save those photos and send them to me. The inclusion of some candid personal photos sealed the deal for me, and again, stupid as I am, I didn't really consider that whoever Handcuffs really was, they could have just found other photos of this unalive lass who was a public figure. Me and Handcuffs talked for a while, and then she confessed her love for me. And I believed this, obviously, because I was an arrogant little sod who thought that I was a great catch for a Californian glamour model. And I started getting more suspicious, however, when she became dead set on flying me out to Cali to meet her. And that seemed too good to be true, but hey, what's the worst that could happen? A free trip to California? Then she said that because of the way the exchange rate works, she could only buy a ticket from the UK to California using GBP, and her bank account didn't allow her to exchange dollars for pounds. Therefore, I'd have to send her the ticket price in pounds and she'd send it back in dollars. And she knew my bank account would automatically convert it because Lloyd's Bank did that apparently. Why a Californian unalive lass was supposed to have insight into the functions of Lloyd's Bank is something I'll never know. But hey, at least it was a good tell that started to open my eyes. I asked her if she could possibly send the money first because I was a little strapped for cash after getting my Peugeot modded. At first she said that was fine and even claimed that she'd done an international transfer, so I should send the money over in the meantime and her transfer would appear in my account later. Yeah, no thanks. I told her I'd have to wait until her transfer came through, and she started ranting about how I didn't really love her and how I wasn't gonna get some if I didn't make the effort and try to appeal to my, baser instincts. And as much as I wanted to believe that I'd be sinking into the bed of an unalive lass, I also wanted to believe that I'd have money to live, so I told her that I genuinely could not send the money back until I had it. Of course, no money showed up, and then she surprised me by saying it was fine. She'd managed to buy the ticket anyway, so I didn't need to worry about the money. I asked her if the plane tickets would be arriving at my house, and she said no. She hadn't been able to arrange that, so I'd have to pick them up from the airport on the day of the flight. I told her that I'd prefer to have the ticket in hand before driving all the way down to Heathrow, or at the very least, could she email me the receipt for the ticket so I knew everything was kosher? And again, she flipped out at this, screaming over instant messenger and hurling some of the worst written abuse I think I'd ever seen in my life. Hell, at this point I didn't even care if she was genuine, Californian hot girl or not. Never stick your head in crazy, as they say. And so I told her to have a nice life, blocked her, and moved on thinking that I was no worse for wear. I did kind of miss her, or miss the things that I'd imagined getting up to with her, but it was whatever. And a few days later, I was strolling through town with a couple of the boys when I heard a female voice yelling my name with some absolute venom. I turned to look, and an ex-girlfriend from year 8 came bounding across the high street. Lucy was a large Wiccan girl who had been a smaller, quiet girl when we dated. We just kind of drifted apart after just a few weeks, simply not vibing, and I'd never even thought about her since. We were in 6th form college now, and I saw her around at times, often being quite loud and mouthy, and was always glad that I dodged a bullet with that one. And now she was storming over to me, swinging her big woolen black bag, pentagrams jangling around her neck, mascara smeared around her eyes. And she came up to me and jabbed me in the chest with a porky finger, hollering at me that I had no idea what I'd missed out on, and that I'd regret not paying her what I owed her for the heartbreak. She began screeching that she was going to put a spell on me and my friends, and that my genitals would fall off. Then she mentioned a few things that only handcuffs would know, and that's when I realized. Handcuffs was Lucy, my weird Wiccan ex-girlfriend from year 8, and I'd been successfully and decisively catfished by this crazy bitch. My mates would give me the ribbing of a lifetime about this later, but right now Lucy seemed genuinely unhinged and dangerous. She was talking as if she genuinely believed that she was handcuffs, and had at least summoned or manifested her, and that if I'd just sent her the money to pay her rent, then everything would have been forgiven and we could have gone back to being in love. I asked her what needed forgiving, and she said the fact that I broke up with her. In year 8, lady, like 5 years ago, and we just drifted apart, so I yelled at her, and it absolutely broke her brain. Lucy full-blown leaped on me, slamming me to the floor, and I felt my head hit the side of a granite bench as I fell, and blood began to trickle from my skull. And on top of that, I could feel tiny, sharp pains in my chest as she began to stab me over and over repeatedly with a safety pin. It was more annoying than agonizing, and coupled with the crack in my skull, things were starting to feel very serious. I felt my friends dragging Lucy off me, and the next thing I knew, I was waking up in a hospital. Lucy had accidentally fractured my damn skull when she'd pushed me, and I had a massive bleed on my brain. My chest was also really sore from being stabbed by a damn safety pin, and my parents told me that Lucy was absolutely mortified about nearly killing me. Lucy's parents were insisting that she went into a voluntary rehab stint. Apparently, she'd been pretty heavy into drugs and alcohol, and this was a wake-up call for her. And it was up to me if I pressed charges, and ultimately, I decided not to. But that is the story of how I got catfished, stalked, and almost killed by a fake unalive lass who almost unalived me. For a bit of a happy ending, Lucy went through a stint at rehab and got better. We're not close or anything, but she's a mother of 2 and a fitness instructor now and living her best life. We keep in touch sporadically, though, for class reunions and stuff, and she has an incredibly dark sense of humor like I do, so we're able to joke about her almost killing me. In fact, it was her idea that I write this up, and she proofread and signed off on it. Some of the more damning descriptions of her were added by her, and she said that I should send it to a True Scary Stories channel, and so I settled on sending it to my favorite lad who would never catfish anyone, Let's read. So I've been a listener for a long time, and I've come into your live streams sometimes, and I'm ashamed to say that I've left a few comments laughing at some of the submitting authors for being idiots. I've always felt a bit guilty about it because deep down I know that I'm just projecting. As about 8 years ago, I got myself into a situation with a weird internet creeper, and I know it really was my own doing. I guess it's easier to take out my frustrations on others than admit fault. My friend Allison warned me about this guy named Jeff. And yeah, it was my own stupid fault. I admit that up front. And Allison told me, "Hey Shan, I met this guy on such and such Facebook group, and he started being all weird and intense with me." And she told me he was into swords and horror and all sorts of edgelord things. She told me that Jeff had mentioned me a few times and that he thought I was interesting. She said she thought he'd been trying to hit me up next. And she was right, he did. And my bored, stupid self, against my better judgment, allowed him to strike up a conversation with me. If you've ever been on the internet at all, anytime between the 2000s and the late 2010s, you'll know guys like Jeff. Intense, serious, quick-to-anger anime fans who love The Killing Joke, Sin City, Firefly, and Arma. They hate the MCU and any mainstream superhero thing. They claim to be huge comic book fans, but get all their information from the Nolan Batman movies. They're an embarrassment to genuine comic book fans and nerds and people who understand why the Joker actually is a cool character, instead of why meme lord incels think he is. True ones understand. And Jeff was not a true one. His favorite game of all time was BioShock Infinite, and this is not to insult that game, but it is relevant and will come up later. And when Jeff started talking to me, it wasn't actually as bad as I expected. He was surprisingly fairly interesting. He had a rudimentary interest in the same things I did, the same comics, movies, anime, and video games. And at first, the cracks didn't show. But then the more he talked about these things, the clearer it became that he was getting all his information from probably Wikipedia or a handful of movie adaptations. He'd make definitive, sweeping statements about media that was just completely wrong or misinformed. For example, he went on about how Batman was his favorite superhero because all of his rogue gallery was totally grounded and normal, nothing weird or comic booky. And this was only true in the movie adaptations, but to an OG Batman comics fan, it's a ridiculous thing to say. I made the mistake of pointing this out to him, and he got super mad and started yelling at me that the comics didn't really count, Weird. Now, I only knew Jeff online, thank God, but every time I'd come online, I'd find lengthy messages from him. After just a week of knowing him, he'd write elaborate essays about how close we were and how much I meant to him and how grateful he was to know someone like me. We had known each other for probably a week at that point. The close friendship he'd imagined in his head soon seemed to sway towards the suggestion of a relationship. I had absolutely no romantic interest in this guy and had made it very clear to him that I wasn't looking, but it was like he heard what he wanted to hear. Multiple times he tried to impress me by crowing on about how he had to break the heart of his last girlfriend because she wanted to sleep with him, and he'd lectured her about how that was inappropriate. When I asked why it was inappropriate, he let slip that he, in his early 30s, had been dating a 16-year-old girl. Not just online either. They were dating in person. And he very smugly told me that he wouldn't sleep with her because it was illegal though, and she was a bad person for wanting to get with him. Okay, buddy. That's the child at fault for sure, I bet. And this is when I decided that I didn't really want to be friends with this weirdo anymore. And one time I told him I was sick and that I wouldn't be online for a while. And after 5 days of frantic messages from him, I kind of snapped and said, "Dude, I was sick." And he kept replying saying, "I knew it. I just knew it." And then proceeded to ramble on about how we had a freaking psychic connection and how he had the same thing with his beloved grandmother and could always tell when something was wrong with a loved one, so he had simply been able to tell that I wasn't okay. Oh right, it was a psychic connection and not the fact that I literally told you 5 days ago. Next, when I wouldn't reply, he began sending me messages saying that he was having severe chest pains and then narrating his journey to the emergency room and leaving vague hints that he had only hours or minutes left to live. The first time, I stupidly fell for it, and then he would simply do it every time he wanted attention. But there was never any follow-up to these medical disasters. An absolute clown man. And when that stopped working, he began to spin sob stories about various elderly relatives he lived with who were on death's door. The problem was, he couldn't remember the stories that he'd spun. So one month it was his beloved granddad who'd raised him who was dying, but the next month it was his grandmother, and then it was his brother, and then his dad, and none of them ever actually did die, and most of them never even got mentioned again. It also contradicted the fact that he previously told me that he lived with a roommate who stole a ton of money off of him but still lived with him, and also that he lived alone. It was just completely nonsensical gibberish, all designed to evoke sympathy. He'd write lengthy attention-seeking diatribes on Facebook about how everyone he knew always wanted to take from him, and how he was an untapped well of positivity and generosity, who was literally incapable of being mean, that he genuinely had some kind of condition that meant that he couldn't be unpleasant to people. And yet somehow he was always managing to condemn women and girls for their behavior, choice of dress, etc., or calling other people fake fans of things he liked, even though he had the most rudimentary understanding of most things. And eventually, it all became too much for me. He'd go on these rants about how desire was disgusting and inappropriate, but also keep trying to hit on me. He'd send me random poorly lit photos of himself. Nothing risque even, just weird photos of him in a hat, and then ask for lengthy opinions on how good he looked, and if he felt like I hadn't said enough, he'd just keep pressing and pressing. Now again, let me stress that I met this guy online for about 6 weeks, and in the end, I told him that things were way too intense for me, and that while I'd be happy to try a friendship with him, we just didn't have the same kind of relationship where we were actually close BFFs or more like he seemed to keep insisting. This was of course my fault, and he lost it with me, getting ragey and angry at the fact that I'd said that I was willing to be his friend. Now why would I say that if I wasn't? I tried to explain to him that being someone's friend doesn't involve constant trauma-dumping, attention-seeking, and claims of psychic bonds. But he was having none of it. He started swearing and cursing at me, so I blocked him. Later, he messaged me on Steam apologizing for what he was about to do. It wasn't clear whether he was going to do something to himself or to me. I wasn't too concerned about the latter, though. We lived in totally different countries, and he was far too broke to fly here and do anything to me. Of course, nothing came of it because guys like him are all terror and bluster. And instead, he posted a huge rant on Facebook about how if you have a beautiful songbird in a cage, it's your duty to let her fly free. It was a quote from BioShock Infinite, and he decided I was Elizabeth from BioShock and he was, I don't know, her dad? Yeah, way to make it even more creepier, pal. It was a pretty terrifying experience, even if I can look back on it and laugh at him. Having someone that toxic in your life is horrible, and I severely learned my lesson about believing people like this are interesting. And I hope the same can be said for my third friend who decided to befriend Jeff even after all of what I'd told her. And last I heard, she'd cut him off because he was trying to convince her to cheat on her husband with him. When I was much younger, I used to hang out on various internet forums. Now, I won't share the names of them because I have no idea if some of them still exist or their archives can be tracked down, and I don't want my dumb teenage self to get me canceled in 2025. Now, I don't actually remember where I specifically met Baghead. It may have just been on Twitter now that I think about it. And he quickly started cropping up on a few places I frequented though, but that wasn't too unusual since most of my online social group came from the same places. It was definitely Twitter where he'd first reached out to chat with me though. And now I'm pretty guarded and savvy about people wanting to befriend and talk to me, but Back then, I was kinda happy to chat to anyone, which is a big mistake. Baghead wasn't the first weirdo who latched onto me through my forum use, but he was most definitely the most intense. After a few days of talking, he began to hint that not only was I his soulmate, but he was most definitely mine too. If you've never had someone try to convince you of that, there's a pretty big difference. And when someone's trying to get with you, it's easy enough for them to list all of the things they like about you to try and flatter you. Now, Baghead did all of this, but he also constantly talked about the ways we'd be compatible. And hopefully you can imagine what I mean by that. And I stress that I did absolutely nothing to provoke this kind of conversation. In fact, a bit of backstory about me, I have no interest in that kind of thing whatsoever due to some deeply unpleasant events in my childhood. In fact, I'd go so far as to say that I can be extremely traumatized by intimate talk and intrusive intimate suggestions. I learned very quickly on the internet that, in the words of a great philosopher, not to be some woke asshole, but women have it hard, man. And that's why every time I made a new friend, especially a guy, I was always very upfront and clear about the fact that I only wanted friendship. Actively wasn't interested in romance or more, and simply wasn't wired that way. And I wouldn't become friends with a guy until I was sure that he understood this. Baghead assured me that he understood this and sympathized, and even had a sister who was in the same position as me and blah 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 blah. I'm not sure I ever really fell for it, but you can still see why that it was a bit of a shock when, after a week, he sent me a lengthy confession admitting his love for me. If it had just been that, I think that we could have moved on from it, but he also included some fairly explicit descriptive talk about things that he'd like for us to do together, things that just hadn't ever been discussed between us. He also drew some very gross anime-style fan art of me, which pretty much unsettled me. And it was completely unprompted. I was horrified, but stupid me, I tried to explain to him that we didn't have that kind of relationship and that I didn't want to have that kind of interaction with him. Now, I can totally understand Baghead being disgusted at his mistake. I kind of expected him to disappear forever after this. Instead, he threw a huge pity party tantrum, ranting and raving and screaming about how much of a terrible person he was and how he ruined everything, how he destroyed everything beautiful, and how no friendship could ever last because of his stupid head. He said he wanted to cave his own skull in and cut his own face off and all sorts of extreme frantic stuff. At the time, I was young and dumb and naive, like I said, and didn't realize that this was an emotionally abusive attention-seeking technique, so my stupid ass was genuinely concerned for Baghead. Naturally, I went out of my way to reassure him that it was okay, that he hadn't screwed anything up, and that I'd still be his friend. I told him I didn't really appreciate the weird fanfic about me, but I hadn't clicked on it, so it was no big deal. Baghead calmed down but started sending me photos of himself, clearly not wearing a shirt and asking what I thought of his face and hair. And he had long, messy hair and was clearly proud of it, and beyond that, he was just a normal, stocky dude. Not bad looking, but like I said, I'm not wired that way. And I told him he looked good though, trying to just be nice, and that was clearly a mistake. He kept sending me more and more photos, mirror selfies that showed off more and more of his pasty chest. And it ended with half of our conversations just involving him spamming me with selfies and asking what I thought of his face and hair. And what was I supposed to keep saying? Eventually, I told him it was getting a bit much and that I didn't really know what to say in response to all the identical selfies that were getting more and more bathroom-focused. And I very gently suggested that I'd prefer that he would wear a shirt in them, you know? And this led to another absolutely terrifying meltdown. This time, he sent me messages and posted tweets talking about how he should cut his heart out of his chest, carve loser into his flesh, cut his hands and arms off, and then finally cut his face off again. This time, I wasn't quite as intimidated by it because he'd made these threats before and never so much as even slapped himself on the cheek. But it's still pretty horrible to hear an adult male screaming about how disgusting he is in voice notes, especially when you know that the implication is that you made him feel that way. Once again, it fell to me to try and make him feel better and assure him that it was fine. He hadn't ruined our friendship and all that stuff. And he acted really sad and volatile for a day or two, and I was starting to worry that maybe he actually would do some harm to himself. And that's when he messaged me with a request that would make him feel better. His self-confidence was at an all-time low, he said, and the only way he saw himself getting out of it was if a female friend could give him a confidence boost and tell him that his unclothed body was attractive. Yeah, he was asking to send that kind of photos so I would say that he looks good to help his mental health. And this was too much for me. I told him that I would prefer that he didn't do that and that it's something that he should save for a future partner. And then I just hit offline for the next few days. Now, during this time, he had an absolute meltdown on social media, making vague references to how his toxic self had ruined yet another friendship, and how he was a negative and cancerous presence in other people's lives, etc. All very intense, scary stuff for a young woman like myself. And I ignored it and pretended that I didn't see it. And after a few days, he sent me an offline message asking if I was okay and if he'd done anything wrong. Not wanting to get into drama, I told him that he hadn't, and I was just going through some really difficult PTSD things. Baghead told me he understood and that he'd leave me to it. The next day, I received an email from Baghead, and I expected some kind of drama or hand-wringing, but instead it was a video file and a single sentence that said, "To cheer you up." I did not click on that video file because I know better than to open unknown video files emailed unexpectedly from weirdos. Instead, I asked Baghead what he'd sent me, and as blunt as you could imagine, he told me it was a video of him enjoying himself in a solo manner that he'd made for me to cheer me up and make me feel better. And I was so horrified to the point that I was actually mad at him, but I also knew how volatile he got and how he threatened to hurt himself every time I rejected him. I decided that I'd just politely say that I wasn't really interested, and then just slowly stop communicating with him. If I blocked him on instant messengers, he wouldn't know because I usually set my status to appear offline anyways. And I told him that I wasn't going to watch the video and reminded him that I was specifically dealing with childhood trauma, so it wasn't really my type of thing. And instead of losing his mind for a change, he actually started lecturing me on how it would be good for me and how it would make me feel better and how I really should just give his video a watch to see if I enjoyed it because he was confident it would essentially fix me. And I hope it's clear at this point, but Baghead didn't really know me that well or have any insight as to why I wasn't interested in this stuff, beyond him being creepy and weird in the first place. I just told him I wasn't and that I don't feel like he was owed any answers. And all I'd say is that he was absolutely off the mark and there was no way that this was an appropriate thing to subject me to. I'm calm about it when I recount the story, but at the time it was genuinely really weighing on me. Baghead was a volatile, angry, pushy guy. He had this whole shtick of understanding women's struggles, but used it almost exclusively to talk down to me and then act like he could fix my trauma essentially by sending me all sorts of disgusting imagery of himself. It was gross, terrifying, and overwhelming. So I stopped speaking to him on Instant Messenger, and he did not take this well. To start, I still followed him on Twitter and Facebook because I was terrified of the drama that would result in me blocking or unfollowing him in a way that he could see, and he fully took advantage of that. And the week after I refused to watch his creepy video, he posts thousands and thousands of words of rants on Twitter and Facebook. And at first he kept talking about how he always drove people away and how he was a toxic poison. Quickly though, he started blaming a third party, me obviously, and ranting about how everyone took advantage of him, spat on his kindness, manipulated and dismissed him, blee blah blue, cry me a river. And he was clearly trying to make me feel guilty as hell, and it almost worked. Instead, something kind of snapped in me and I just got really, really mad. In retrospect, this was my first big experience with a guy being persistently creepy to me online in a way that encroached on my personal space and threatened to affect me directly. Since I'd never really dealt with anything quite like this before, I wasn't sure how to handle it, and decided that it would be just better to tell him that I needed to cut him off rather than just do it and have him discover I'd blocked him by chance. Part of me was really worried that he could track me down where I live. He lived fairly close by, definitely feasible to just drive to see me. And these days, it's not too hard to find someone online if you really want to. I DM'd him on Twitter and said, "Hey, this is really doing a number on my mental health, and I can't keep seeing this on my feed, so I'm going to unfollow and block you, but please just move on and leave me alone, and I won't call you out for harassment and all of that." Then I unfollowed him, gave it some time so I could be sure that he'd seen my message, and then blocked him too. I didn't look at his feed for some time myself, but a few days later, a friend I'd told about the situation let me know that Baghead was posting some pretty extreme stuff on his Twitter. He was again talking about how sick he was of being walked over and taken advantage of, and that on Monday, everything would change. People would look at him differently, and they would know that he was a serious person who wasn't to be messed with, and that the person who'd recently trampled on his heart would discover the result of her actions. And I was sick worrying about this. Was he threatening to harm me or himself? I asked my friend and even my mom if they thought that I should try and report him to law enforcement and all that, and I didn't actually know his real name or address. I just knew the state that he lived in, so what could I do? A relative is a local cop, so I at least let them know that this guy was potentially behaving threatening towards me. Thankfully, Monday came and I didn't have to wait for the knife to drop or the trigger to be pulled. Baghead revealed the big dramatic event that he'd been foreshadowing. It was a haircut. He had a haircut, transforming his long hair into a short, neat, regimented buzz cut. And that was the dire action this chump took. And when I looked on his feed, he was a few tweets into rambling and a pretentious essay about how this was a new him and he was no longer going to offer his heart and soul to those who'd trample on it. And sure thing, friendo. Feel free to keep your heart and soul firmly in your pants going forward. And with that, I never looked at this creep's social media feed again. And thank God he never decided to escalate things with me beyond online harassment. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. EST, and there are super fun live streams every Sunday and Wednesday night. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. And I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, 28 inches is coming for you later.